Ladies and gentlemen, if you could take your seats, we're going to begin in just a couple of minutes. We're leaving a little bit of extra time here because the previous session ran over, which is not atypical for events like this. And we want to give people who are on coffee break a chance to get back. So in a couple of minutes we'll begin, but if you want to take your seats, grab a chair. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you all for being here. This is the Charting the Path Back to Growth session, and we have a very distinguished panel here to talk about some of the problems that we're encouraging, that we're in communication strategy. The folks I'm about to introduce all have different roles to play and different perspectives on the challenges that we're facing. So I'm going to introduce each of them, ask them to speak for 5 to 7 minutes. We'll have a group discussion after that, and then I hope we'll be able to have some time for all of you to ask some questions that you might have of the panel on what I think is a pretty important, I think we'd all agree is a pretty important topic. Directly to my right, Ivo German is the Deputy State Secretary and head of the Foreign Economic Affairs Directorate of the State Secretariat for Economic Affairs in Switzerland. To his right, Andres Rodriguez Poze is the Princesas, I'm going to try to get this right now, the Princesas de Asturias Chair, Professor of Economic Geography at LSE. Mirek Dusek, to his right, is the Managing Director at the World Economic Forum in Coligny, Switzerland. Christian Migreles is to his right, and Christian is the chairman of EXA International. Ivalo Izvorsky is to his right. Ivalo is the chief economist for Europe and Central Asia at the World Bank. And our host from Kazakhstan, Beknur Nesebayev, is the CEO of Astana Motors, a growing concern here in the automobile industry. So we'll start with Ivo. If you could give us just a quick overview of how you see the challenges we face. And I, just before we start, have outlined what I think would be 5 areas where we're seeing headwinds in the global economy. We have the lingering COVID pandemic. It's over officially, according to the World Health Organization, but people, I'm sorry to say, are still dying, and the lingering after effects of the COVID pandemic are still with us. Debt issues, various other economic issues. Deglobalization is another headwind that I think all of us are probably experiencing or able to talk about. There's an increased effort to regionalize. The war in Ukraine is creating its own global inflation. And finally, the geopolitical tensions between China and the West, which affect in some ways economic decisions that are being made by Western and Chinese allies. So those are not an exhaustive list of the headwinds, but let's consider them a starting point. And people here on our panel, feel free to add to that. I'm not an economist. You folks probably know more about this than I do. Ivo, start us off.
Thank you, Charles. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be here and represent the Swiss government's view on, well, you mentioned it, the headwinds, but I'm glad that we can also concentrate on the path to growth and therefore, look towards the future and potential solutions. But maybe let me begin with a few words about Switzerland's relation with Kazakhstan. We have very good and friendly relations in various areas. We celebrated 30 years of diplomatic relations. We appreciate the long-standing and excellent cooperation with Kazakhstan in the World Bank constituency, where we also represent their voice and have, a common voice in the World Bank as an important multilateral institution. I'm also happy to note in the economic sphere that our relations are very good. Kazakhstan is the most important economic partner for Switzerland in Central Asia, but Switzerland is also the third largest investor in Kazakhstan, according to the Kazakh National Bank. So over 40 Swiss companies are active on the Kazakh market. And the potential is far from being tapped. So if we can address those challenges, then I think the sky is the limit, and we're really happy about what we see in terms of the reform program launched by the Kazakh government in 2022. Because the key elements, they are actually already pointing towards those paths back to growth. And they're important for Swiss businesses, as all businesses. Key elements are economic diversification, privatization, development of the SME sector, digitalization, strengthening the rule of law, and the development of human capital. Those are the issues that Swiss companies want to see, that progress continues, and that's what makes them attracted to the market. So we have all these headwinds, but we're looking at the Central Asian market as a whole, as a region as well. Apart from Kazakhstan, there are other promising markets. For example, Uzbekistan, we heard it today, where important economic reforms are taking place. And we heard it loud and clear, strengthening regional economic connectivity in Central Asia, marked, for example, by faster rail and road transport within the region and beyond, a reduction of tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, cooperation in science and education, as well as an easier cross-border labor market access for skilled workers would be significant drivers for growth and would truly make your region even more attractive for foreign investment. My conviction about the effectiveness of the aforementioned structural reforms is based on the experience of my own country, to which I would like now to shift my focus. Switzerland is known for its successful economy with highly productive companies. We have a reliable infrastructure, a well-educated workforce, and predictable, yet maybe rather boring politics. Those stable conditions have contributed to making Switzerland an attractive location for companies to invest in and attract highly qualified talent from all over the world. This, however, is by itself not sufficient. An important factor which may be forgotten sometimes is to have a competition-friendly economic policy. In the end, it's competition that provides incentives to keep innovating and improving productivity. And Switzerland is well known. For the past 12 years, we have been ranked first in the Global Innovation Index. And it is not without reason that our most productive companies are the export-oriented companies that have to compete on world markets, such as the pharmaceutical industry or the producers of machinery equipment. And one of the key components of competition in a medium-sized economy like Switzerland is its openness towards the foreign markets. And that points towards some of the headwinds that you've been referring to. We need open markets because we have few natural resources and a limited domestic market, so we're heavily reliant on international trade. And we therefore benefited greatly from globalization in recent decades. And so de-globalization, as you mentioned, is really a threat to our ability to interact with markets such as Central Asia. The COVID pandemic has clearly demonstrated the importance of a broad network of foreign trading partners in order to strengthen the resilience of our production chains. And in our foreign economic strategy, diversification is important. We have very important partners such as the EU, the US, Asia, and then within Asia, a diversification is also important. That's why we have also our economic development cooperation, with which we work intensively with Central Asian nations, and we have also other Asian nations that are priority countries. So we really try to connect the dots. The multilateral approach and the rules-based multilateral trading system is for us and was a key ingredient of wealth creation. And multilateral solutions continue to be the best way to avoid discrimination between countries and regions. We also have bilateral trade agreements, free trade agreements, over 33 agreements with 43 partners. And so that's something that we're also investing in to have a good balance between bilateral and multilateral solutions. We try to reduce the administrative burden. We will abolish all remaining industrial tariffs in Switzerland unilaterally. We take this step because we think as a trading nation, this is what our companies need. But besides efforts to increase productivity growth in Switzerland, we also need to strengthen the economic resilience. We had a slump of minus 2.4% growth during the COVID pandemic. So we experienced a sharper decline compared to 2009. But fortunately, the Swiss economy, but also the global economy, recovered relatively quickly. And so the COVID-19 pandemic was followed almost seamlessly by the war in Ukraine. You mentioned it again, with a sharp rise in energy prices and a risk of energy shortages, also in Switzerland. But in Switzerland, we have a relatively low energy intensity, and the rise in inflation in Switzerland was very moderate. We saw, however, also the volatility of the international system now with the crisis of Credit Suisse, which necessitated the takeover by US and some support by the government and the Swiss National Bank. I can say here that the merger is progressing well, but we're not isolated from the international system. So let me sum up. What are the main ingredients for a path back to a hopefully strong and sustainable growth? First, it's not enough to focus on good infrastructure, well-educated workforce, or predictable politics. What is needed is that we foster dynamic competition in the internal market and internationally. Second, Switzerland is convinced that even in times of rising protectionism, the best strategy for small economies is to increase our openness towards foreign markets, based on a strong and rules-based multilateral trading system. Third, climate change, the loss of biodiversity and pollution pose significant risk for the economy and our society as a whole. However, technological innovation and entrepreneurship also pave the way to potential solutions. So I see the positive side there as well, especially for the heavily technology-oriented Swiss businesses. Fourth, we need to lower the administrative burden of our companies and expand digitalization. And having said this, there remain challenges to increase the resilience of the economy, as was demonstrated by the recent disruptions of supply chains and the threat of deglobalization. Let's therefore continue investing in dialogue in forums such as today and bring together thought leaders from academia, businesses, governments, and diplomacy to tackle these challenges and unlock the opportunities going forward?
Ivo, thank you very much. I think you've given us a lot to pick up on as we go forward, and I certainly neglected in my list of 5 headwinds to put climate change. That should certainly be the 6th that I think everybody's going to be considering. Andres, pick up from there.
Thank you very much, Ivo, and thank you very much, Charles. You mentioned headwinds, and you mentioned also the whole issue of deceleration of growth. But I'm going to bring good news for a start. The world is now far richer, and the people in the world are far better off than they were 2 decades ago. We have witnessed 2 decades of relatively high growth over the last 20 years, and this growth has been fundamentally concentrated in specific parts of the world and mainly in Asia. China, South Asia, most parts of Southeast Asia, but a country like Kazakhstan have done particularly well out of this. And as a result, the quality of life, the opportunities and the potential of many people has been significantly enhanced. But the good news doesn't come with the other side, which is the bad news, that this wealth promotion, this dynamism hasn't happened, is not happening everywhere. If we take a look at the same measure, today there are 643 million people living in regions in the world that are worse off than they were in 2000. They have incomes that are below what they were 2 decades ago. And in that respect, that represents a problem. Why? Because many of these people have got significant challenges and are going to face much bigger headwinds than the people that are doing very well. Most of these areas that are growing very slowly are concentrated in Africa and in Latin America, but it's not just something that affects continents. They are spread in 134 countries. And even in a country like Kazakhstan that I mentioned before has done particularly well, is a country that has 2 regions, one very rich, Mangistau, and the other one among the poorest regions in the country, Turkestan, where the GDP per capita today is below what it was in 2000. So in that respect, there's a need to address problems in many places because there are pockets of lack of dynamism, lack of growth, virtually everywhere. What haven't governments done and multilateral organizations, international organizations done until now? Well, we have adopted a relatively static sort of approach based on levels. On the one hand, at the international level, but also, for example, within countries, within the European Union, we have focused on the poorest of the poor, and rightly so. We have put money and resources into promoting development in those places that were at the bottom of the scale, at the bottom of the pyramid. But at national level, we have very often aimed to promote the concentration of economic activity in our large cities, in our large metropolis, in our large agglomerations, with the idea that by generating the size, accumulating human resources, accumulating firms and innovative firms, these were going to become the motors of the whole of the economy. The idea would be, if you are in Kazakhstan, you invest in Astana, you invest in Almaty, and then the dynamism of these 2 cities would promote the rest of the country, development in the rest of the country, or even in Uzbekistan, you do it in Tashkent and it would spread out. The problem is that this normally never works. Why? Because on the one hand, yes, some big cities have done very, very well. Some poor areas have done very well and caught up. Many parts of Central and Eastern Europe that were dirt poor just 20, 25 years ago are now at levels of development that are above many countries in Southern Europe. But others have not performed as well. And we have plenty of examples of poor areas that have not grown in Africa, and plenty of large cities, and that should be the motors of development, that have not done particularly well. So if we put this in an equivalent of an airplane, we are flying the economy, the world economy, but also our national economies, on an airplane that has 4 motors on 2 motors, or 1 motor and very often those motors are malfunctioning. So we're not flying very well, and when you hit the headwinds, you're likely to start nosediving and not going in the right direction. So what can we propose? And I'm chairing the committee of the European Union for the future of cohesion policy, which is the largest development policy in the world. And I don't know what we're going to be proposing, but the proposals are going in this direction. We should first keep on highlighting that this is not something that is going to be addressed by itself, that the market is not going to solve, that we need to intervene. And we need to intervene, especially after COVID, especially in terms of the green transition, with active policies, very often industrial policies that used to be a dirty word until relatively recently. We should keep on focusing on the poorest of the poor. We should keep on putting resources in poor areas because they got significant capacity to grow, and by putting money there, there's always potential that this potential is going to be mobilized. But on top of that, we need to put into perspective this dynamic dimension. That there are many regions, like I mentioned in the case here of Turkestan and Mangistau, that are in what can be named as a development trap. They are in terms of income, in terms of employment, in terms of productivity, very often less dynamic than the rest of the countries they're in or the regions they're in, and they're also less dynamic than when they were in the past. So these are areas that have got significant potential that needs to be mobilized, and there's a need to focus and put policies into many areas. I'm thinking about northern France, northern Italy, the Rust Belt, the area around the Great Lakes in North America, but also many parts of Kazakhstan that have been stuck in this development trap to make them dynamic, because it's not that they have lost their dynamism overnight. And third, there's a need to make sure that we put significant emphasis on creating opportunities for people who have got talent and potential wherever they are. Because there's talent everywhere, but the opportunities do not arise everywhere. If we do that, I think I'm convinced that we might be able to juggle the headwinds that you mentioned, Charles, much better than we are doing at the moment, that we will be able to tackle the challenges of the future, artificial intelligence that was mentioned this morning, the green transition, the digital transition, and we will make sure that we, on the one hand, dynamize the economic potential of every place, making sure that we provide more opportunities and better livelihoods for people across the world, wherever they live. Thank you.
That was a relatively optimistic take, I think, in terms of the headwinds that we're facing. And when we follow up, I hope we can ask some questions about national industrial policy, that sort of thing, which tends to veer in the direction of protectionism, I think, quite often. So we'll pick that up as we go into discussion phase. Mirek, pick it up from here.
Thank you. Glad to be here. Let me start with where we are, the short-term growth outlook as we see it at the World Economic Forum. You may know we work with all stakeholders, but we work also with a lot of companies around the world. So that will also shape a little bit my remarks. Let me just start with a little bit of recent history, because Ms. Georgieva mentioned something that I think is really crucial. I remember last summer I was preparing the annual meeting in Davos, intellectually preparing for this past January, and I remember the dire scenarios around the global economy, and particularly around the European economy, and of course dire predictions around inflation, dire predictions around the imminent recession. Every month there was recession is imminent. And of course, cost of living crisis. Of course, we have it if you take Europe, but it could have been much worse. I'd just like to reiterate that we've seen some surprising resilience. Again, if I particularly look at Europe over the past few months. Having said that, it's true we are in a low growth environment. We see that the theme of this session is charting the path back to growth. And so if we just look at that, of course, I remember early spring, we were even looking, I think it was World Bank or IMF saying under 2%. Now we're saying over 2%, but it's still a drop from last year. It's of course a drop also from the average of 10 years, about 3.4%, to your point about really a very nice period of growth that we had in the past. Now, within that though, still in the short term, I would like to mention that there are obviously different sentiments, and some of you also mentioned it. We do, of course, have major growth markets in the global economy right now. I am now preparing a lot for something we're doing in Asia, and so if you just look at that, if you look at here, 5%, we just heard it this morning, but you look at, of course, China over 5%, India over 5%, Vietnam over 6%, Philippines over 6%. So those are really important growth markets. And so if you just take China, obviously almost $20 trillion economy. So if they grow 5%, you're talking 1 trillion added to the global GDP. India, China alone would be over half of the global GDP. So it's just important for us, and maybe it's me talking as a European, that there are different narratives around growth right now. Again, that's the short term. Now, in the long term, I think it's what we are hearing, at least, and what we are seeing in some of the data is that we are in some kind of a transition. So if we say charting the path back to growth, maybe it should be charting the path to growth, because I think people would agree we're not going back to what it used to be pre-COVID in terms of some of the models that we had. And so I think we are in a transition. Now, it's not linear, so people, when you say transition, they may think, okay, this is just some kind of a predetermined path. It's far from it. It's choppy waters on the ocean, winds blowing in different direction. So for that, just allow me to say a few things that companies, as we speak with them, are thinking about in terms of growth opportunities. And I will just mention it very briefly, and then I'm happy to expand on it later. There are, of course, two kind of strategic assumptions right now on the part of the companies, that we will be moving to the net, clean energy economy, net zero economy. We're moving there, so there is investment in that. And while, of course, I think the previous session talked a lot about the gaps and the multilateral processes, etc. But I'm sure those of you who are working with the private sector, you're also seeing the uptake of investing in technologies, trying to figure out climate finance, etc. So this is really top of mind. And how do we make sure this is a growth area? Number two, of course, and it's not in order of importance. Obviously, this is the year of AI, but overall tech and the digital transformation, again, top of mind for companies. Of course, productivity gains, but overall, there are things that can have tremendous value coming out of some of the technological innovations, not only in high tech, by the way, that companies are implementing. Third is people, and on two levels mainly. One is talent and overall kind of workforce well-being, but really top talent. How do you attract, how do you cultivate and retain top talent, but also then to the role of companies in society. There is, of course, increasing realization, and you may have seen it also with the US Roundtable about 2 years ago. They recognized that companies need to work as a stakeholder in society, and so really looking at how can we include more people into the digital and the climate opportunities, because it's not good for anyone if there is less inclusion in society, in the economy, and there is disenfranchisement. Another fourth thing would be resilience. Now, on resilience, people, if you say it, people say, oh, it's a defense. This is kind of implied, okay, we need to protect ourselves. But I think the matter of fact is that we are in this new era. It's going to be a risk-prone era. We saw it with COVID and other shocks. And so how do you make sure that you prepare in a smart way so that you're resilient, but you're still competitive? So this is, of course, what's top of mind for companies too. And final two things I'd like to mention. One is, and you mentioned it in your trends, kind of the wake-up call around geopolitics, because for some companies operating in certain regions, it's always been there, but if you are let's say, a company that is a multinational, big global company, mainly operating in developed markets, if you talk to the CEOs maybe 5 years ago, they wouldn't think this would particularly material to them. Now it's entered the boards So geopolitical and geoeconomic considerations have entered the boards. Obviously, Russia's invasion of Ukraine was a big trigger, but also now you have the US-China relationship obviously top of mind, and happy to expand on that. And the final point that is, I would say, top of mind also in a good way for companies and CEOs in terms of how they navigate and try to contribute to growth is kind of role of government in the economy. So you said you wanted to talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, etc. But it's something that we've now seen emerge. As you know, for economists, or for some economists, it's controversial, but it's happening in the US of all places now, and it's shaping markets in one way or another. And so how do you navigate that as a company also is a big factor. And it's not only on the risk side, it's also, of course, on the opportunity side. Thank you.
Christian, pick it up.
Sorry. Can you hear me now? Okay. So I'm glad to be here because first time I came in Kazakhstan was in the first days of independence. I was at the head of a mission of potential investors at that time, and they almost all invested in Kazakhstan. So I'm very glad to be here after all this time, because I see that the country is well kept, that the economy is getting well, and most of the parameters of a sound economy are reached by Kazakhstan. However, how will be the future, how will shape the future is another thing, because now we are in the period of turbulence, period of hurricanes, and nobody knows what's going to be tomorrow. I want to draw on my experience of Russia to try to illustrate in some manner my suggestions to Kazakhstan. I was writing a book in the early 80s, which was published in America, on protectionism. At that time, my feeling was that globalization was on its way, that protectionism had to be banned, and my book was a pamphlet against protectionism. But at that time, protectionism was still popular, and you had at that time two ideas that were still popular. First was protectionism, and second was autarky. The rule of the big empires at that time was to try to find territories where their resources will be assured and put the hand of these territories to remain independent. So protectionism and autarky they were overcome by globalization principle, and the era of free trade, the era of free enterprise became popular all around the world. I want to tell you the short history of a sector, an industrial sector of Russia, in which I've been working, who is still quite successful, but who is at the eve of a terrible change. This is the sector of fertilizer. This sector was created in Russia from nothing, except gas, of course, from the gas by Brezhnev in the 70s, and all the plants that were bought and built in Russia were from Western countries, were built by Western companies. And shortly, Russia became the first producer of fertilizer in the world and still is, more or less. But while building these plants, the industry forgot to build the necessary components. And all the components of these plants were imported from Western countries. They concentrated on sales and marketing, and they were very successful. And very shortly, Russia became the first exporter of fertilizer in the world, and to some extent still is now. But everything was everything was produced and maintained and repaired and revamped by Western companies. The consequence of this situation is clear today. No more components, no more maintenance. The gas is still flowing into these plants, but these plants are aging and they have no way to be repaired because of the lack of industry of components in Russia. So we started from a state industry. We are now in a free industry, but a free industry, private industry that is without spare parts, without new components, and without money, because most of the money evaporated in Western banks from the people called the oligarchs, and there were a lot of oligarchs in that industry. The conclusion is that, starting from that experience, is that extreme nationalism and extreme liberalism are as dangerous. You have to try to find a way to compensate the rules of the market and to try to save your industry from the grips of politicians. And this is because the state of Russia, the Russians, the Soviet Union, the Russians, were not interested in running economy. They were interested in power. They were interested in money. They were interested in dollars. They were not interested in building strong industries. The experience of the last years show the problems of the modern economies in the course of globalization were to create holes of production. We have seen examples like the masks during the COVID in Europe. We were short of masks because all the production of masks had stopped and was concentrated in China. And now we see that the concentration of raw material for food in Russia and Ukraine creates problem to the whole world. So we are thinking back. We are going back to the old principles, the old theories of autarky on one hand, and protectionism on the other hand. And everybody now is trying to invent strategic plans to try to keep up with these two problems of globalization, of interdependence. So having that in mind, I think that Kazakhstan, because we are in Kazakhstan and we are talking about Kazakhstan, can retain some elements of these examples and try to find a strategy that cope with the new order of the world. I will give five principles for the strategy of Kazakhstan.
Christian, I have to pull the plug.
Yeah.
And we can pick
5
this
point.
up. We can pick up your 5 principles
Okay.
when we get to discussion. And I
Okay.
particularly want to go back to the comments that you made about COVID in our discussion. So I apologize for cutting you off, but I want to make sure that we get some time for questions to Ivalo. Go ahead.
So just to start, based on what we've heard so far, how is the global economy doing? I think it's not doing well at all. Whether it's 2%, a little bit over 2%, let me give you what 2% means. This is the third weakest pace of expansion after the global financial crisis, after COVID, over the last 3 decades. The US, Japan, EU, all to expand by about 1% this year. And while we have China and India growing by more than 5%, without China and India, emerging economies are growing 1 percentage point more slowly this year than they did last year. The world economy is not well. I mean, of course, we know the proximate causes. Russia's brutal aggression on Ukraine, the high inflation around the world that started peaking in 2021, in mid-2021, and we were deluding ourselves that it was transitory, and so therefore tightening did not happen until much later in 2022. This monetary tightening has been accompanied by fiscal tightening in most countries, and as a result, we see a rising risk of debt distress among developing economies. I mean, pretty much half of the developing economies that we at the World Bank and the IMF use the LIC-DSF, Low-Income Country Debt Sustainability Framework, to assess are at high risk of debt distress or in debt distress. So for this part of the world, obviously China, Asia is important. Kazakhstan exports commodities. 90% of exports are commodities, so therefore it's integrated with the world. But for most of the countries in Europe and Central Asia that we focus on in my unit, what matters most is the EU. And so how is the EU doing? And you know better than me, the EU is the sick man of the world economy. Growth projections are somewhere between 0.5% to 1% a year, with large risks of reversal, very likely further monetary tightening in the EU that would result in higher interest rates on government debt, and EU countries already have some of the highest debt levels in the world. Just a few statistics to illustrate the problem the EU is in. In 1990, the EU and the United States had the same share of the global economy, 25%. Now the EU's share has come down to 17%, which is the same as China. Fixed investment, which obviously is a key driver of growth, has not been above 25% of GDP in the EU since 1973. It hasn't been above that level for many years in the US as well. Research and development expenditures in the EU are just 2/3 of those in the US. And if you look at the innovation engine in the EU, some countries in the northern part of the continent are doing well, but on average, the EU accounts for less than 10% of global patents. The US has double the share. And so I think when we look at the global economy as an important driver for the economy of Kazakhstan and Europe and Central Asia, look at the economy of the EU, I think prospects are not good at all. In general, the world is in the midst of a structural growth slowdown, and very likely through the end of this decade, we project growth rates are going to fall by about 1 percentage point below what they were a decade earlier. And 1 percentage point, we grow 2% versus 3%, is huge. Countries that grow by 5% can do much more than countries that grow by 3%. And so the topic of today is absolutely essential. I mean, this is so crucial for not prosperity just in Kazakhstan, prosperity around the world, prosperity in developing countries. I'm going to be, in keeping with your requirements, Charles, I'm going to be a bit quick here. And I'm going to say that what the world needs to return back to growth, to stronger growth, it can return to stronger growth by the end of the decade, but all countries have to do the best they have done in the past. They need probably 5 things. One is they need more investments. Fixed investment around the world of less than 23% of GDP is not adequate.
And when we talk about the clean transition, which is a new technology, to implement the clean transition, companies have to invest much more, right? This is how you replenish capital. And if you don't invest more, you're not going to have a smooth and fast clean transition. So therefore, investment, fixed investment. Second, human capital. During the years of COVID, the world lost a tremendous amount of learning because for pretty much, we estimated in the World Bank, for every year of school closures, students lost about 3/4 of a year in learning. They fell behind by 3/4 of a year. And you know many countries, especially the poorer ones, that locked their schools for more than a year. These countries are going to be much farther behind going forward. You know, studies of students that went to school during World War II for Germany and Austria show that these students had much lower earnings during their lifetimes than others who went to school before or after World War II. And so therefore, very crucial, more focus on human capital, quality of learning to reverse the huge drop during COVID. The third one is more labor force participation. I mean, the world is still lagging on labor force participation, notably by women. There has to be better facilitation by governments so that you get a much larger labor force going into the future. Despite all the talk about robots and AI taking our jobs, this is not happening. And so therefore, we need much more substantial increases in the labor force to get stronger growth. Finally, I think we need to say that we need to return to much more rational policy making. We need to return to, you know, macroeconomics 2.0. The slow response to the high inflation in 2021 meant that in 2022, countries such as the US, Europe, the ECB, and others had to implement very large policy hikes. And these very surprising policy hikes resulted also in financial stress, which perhaps hasn't healed completely yet, but also resulted in much higher lending rates and much higher rates on government securities. So I think it's important to come back to much more rational policy making. We have argued before COVID that it was time to turn off the fiscal spigot, right? Stop these large, very large fiscal government spending. This did not happen. Government debt levels have increased very substantially. And now is actually time to do that because these countries around the world have to rebuild fiscal buffers, not least to meet the challenges of the green transition and facilitate much better human capital accumulation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivalo. Beknur, you get to have the last word.
Yeah, thanks, Charles. Thanks for invitation for such kind of interesting discussion. And it's a great honor for me to be here because our country only 2 years ago celebrated 30 years independence. And that time I was 8 years old. And now I sit here with you, with experienced and respected speakers who know everything about world economy. And in this case, of course, I want to tell about our story, about our country and our company. Our company, Astana Motors, are active on car manufacturing, distributors and dealers, retail, on Kazakhstan market and Uzbekistan market also. And Charles, you touch very interesting topic today, and we felt this challenge last 4 years very deeply because we have partners from Europe, from Korea, from Japan, from China. It's more than 16 car brands who are working with us, and we are distributor of 14 of them, and we are responsible for supply this car, for supply spare parts, for semiconductors, and we feel all these challenges. First of course, it's COVID-19, and after then came another one big problem for car industry. It's a deficit of semiconductors. After then, of course, problem of supply chain and this war. It's not easy to manage, but for us, it's like daily work. we come to work and something happened and we try to find a way to reach this problem. And for our company and for our country, it's of course challenged, but we also see opportunities. We are entrepreneur, we are from active business, and all time we want to find some way to develop our company and our country. And in this case, we have, I think, a good chance to develop our country. Why? First, we are between China and Europe, and we are on New Silk Way. It's a big possibility for us to create logistic business and supply items from China to Europe. And the second, unfortunately, but a lot of European, Japanese brands leave Russia Federation, and we work with these brands, and we feel how they change strategy. These companies start to think about Central Asia and more concentrate in Central Asia. Kazakhstan is the heart of Central Asia, and we feel support every time that these our partners want to give for us chance to create new production, to create new factories, to develop localization, everything. And also, our speakers touch about deglobalization. And for example, for Switzerland, maybe it's some risk, but for Kazakhstan it's a chance. Because our government wants to create new industry from commodities to real industry. And at this game, some of protectionism and some of deglobalization help for our company to create new real industry, for example, car industry. So why Astana Motors company already invested for 2 factories. One of them is Hyundai factory in Almaty, where we produce Hyundai passenger vehicles. Second one is a commercial vehicle factory, where we produce buses, commercial vehicles, and etc. But it's not enough for create real car industry, because capacity of this plant it's not enough for produce spare parts, after components, and we have a new big target. 2 months ago, we announced that we will construct new big factory, and it will be Chinese factory. We negotiate with largest Chinese companies to join under one roof 3 brands. It's Chery, Haval, and Changan. Frankly speaking, they never saw each other and never don't handshake, but they are signed with us agreement, and they give for us chance to construct new factory. And this factory will be 90,000 units capacity per year. And this number give for us chance to create localization. And we believe to our country, our government all time want to support companies, international or local, who want to create production and develop industry, and thanks for our government. And we must be brave, we must be patriot to invest to our countries, and we want to show to another our competitors and partners, do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Beknur. Let's talk about COVID for a minute. You've all heard of the term long COVID. Let's talk about long COVID in terms of the economy. Just using the US example, when COVID hit 3 years ago, suddenly we found we needed masks that we didn't make. Had to pick up the phone to China, our biggest economic competitor, and say, can you please send us some masks? That led to some rethinking of the economy as we looked around and realized there were supply chain issues that were complicating the delivery of what seemed like essential goods. We couldn't manufacture automobiles because we didn't have chips. That kind of rethinking led to a kind of, I guess they call it regionalization now, or nationalization of our economy, as people started looking for how we could start making things at home again. That seems to be a phenomenon that's been replicated in many different countries around the world. My question for the panel, and Mirek, I'm going to direct this first to you because the World Economic Forum is so identified with the whole concept of globalization, is how permanent is that kind of rethink of the economy, or is this just a phenomenon that will fade as we no longer are confronting COVID? Is this something, according to the managing director of the IMF this morning, this is costing us percentages of global GDP. Is this a lasting long COVID phenomenon?
Yeah, no, thank you. I think definitely it was a shaping moment. I think going back to what I said, that we believe we are in some kind of a transition, this is shaping that transition. Now, obviously there are different terms being thrown around, nearshoring, friendshoring, etc. I don't know who, what we are seeing is that people are trying to calibrate that. So more and more you're realizing that maybe not all things you thought you could either have within your sovereignty or have with friends are actually feasible. And so I think that after the first shock, we are seeing and getting to the real picture on how this rewiring will work. Going back to the deglobalization thing, as you can imagine, we did have a few dialogues on that and work, and I would look at it more as a kind of a rewiring of the global economy. Obviously, there are costs to fragmentation, so Ms. Georgieva is absolutely right. But I think the jury is still out on what kind of rewiring that will be. And I think people are getting also a little more, or getting a more of a real world view of what are the kinds of things that you really need to, for security purposes, etc., have within your sovereignty or within the realm of your coalitions and alliances, and what are the kinds of things that maybe you just need to diversify. So it's not just one source of thing, but you have 5 or 6 of them, so that if one source becomes problematic, you have other sources to go to without necessarily need to nearshore it to a very expensive factory on your home turf. Again, I think the jury is still out, but definitely a shaping moment for the global economy.
I picked on you, Mirek. Andres, pick up on this.
I think this is a fundamental change. I agree with Mirek. This is a structural change, but for 3 reasons. You highlighted one. COVID taught us that we need to build resilience within our economies, that global value chains can be cut for whatever reason very quickly, and therefore economies need to be prepared for that. Second reason, geopolitical tensions, reflected by the war of aggression of Russia in Ukraine, but all the geopolitical tensions that we're seeing on a daily basis. And I would add a third one that I think is as important, if not more important, that the tensions, the concentration of economic activities within countries is leading to questioning many of the political systems that we have. And the Inflation Recovery Act in the US, to a large extent, is an industrial policy in disguise to promote the areas of the country that have been in decline for a long time, but also that have been voting for Trump or equivalent in the last elections. Now the question is this an industrial policy? Yes. Is it here to stay? Yes. Is it bad? Well, it depends. For the last 3 decades, and this is purely an Anglo-Saxon view from economists, industrial policy was a dirty word. But industrial policy was practiced very, very actively and very effectively in many Asian countries. First it was Singapore, Taiwan, South Korea, Japan, then it was China that led, and they led successful industrial policies that benefited them and benefited the rest of the world. What you were highlighting before is a different ballgame, is industrial policy with protectionism, good. And economists don't agree on anything, virtually. But there's one thing that economists agree on is that strong protectionism and autarky is bad for everyone. But everyone, especially the country that practices it, we don't want to become, no one wants to become North Korea. So if we have industrial policy in an open mind to improve production, both in industry and in services, this should be welcome, because it would make our economies far more resilient and in many ways more sustainable and more proof to the risks. If it does go in the direction of we are starting to protect our economy, we're going to create sheltered economies with shielded industries that are going to be bad for everyone and especially bad for the country that's proposing them.
Yeah. Anybody else want to chime in on this? Yes, Ivo.
Yes, thank you, Charles. Yeah, I see quite a high level of convergence here because I made some notes and actually the colleagues talked exactly about that. And in the Swiss case, we always say we do not do a vertical industrial policy. We refrain from industrial policies. We do, if any, then a horizontal industrial policy where we set good framework conditions for our businesses to thrive. But what we are seeing now, and it's clearly defining moment, it could turn out to become a subsidy race. There was clearly a need for some fiscal stimulus in the COVID context, but if that turns into something which is permanent and which has all these protectionist ingredients, then I think we will start to suffer. And it was interesting how the debate evolved. We started hearing about this reshoring thing, which we thought made us very nervous because we were so heavily integrated, and then the next word was nearshoring, which was better, but still kept us nervous because if you're in America and you hear about nearshoring, you're thinking of Mexico and Canada maybe. And then you mentioned it, in a 150-page report on supply chains, there was once mentioned the word friendshoring, and I find that quite interesting because, as I always say, allies share objectives, but friends share norms, and values. And so I think there should be, and we talked a lot about dialogue here. We're here, this is a forum for dialogue. We should talk about what norms bring us together, also in our trade relations. I talked about the multilateralism, the crisis of multilateralism, because that's where we agree on some norms, on some rules. It should be a rules-based trade. And I think then we can reap the benefits of open trade. So I would say industrial policies, they might be here to stay. I also refer to some opportunities that we see, but it needs to be on the basis of a level playing field. It should not lead to a subsidy race. It should not lead to a protectionist and, a world economy that is, becoming more and more fractured.
Cynical politicians might say, "Good luck with that." It's going to be that's going to be a challenging headwind all in itself. We have time for a few questions from the audience. If anyone would like to ask a question of anyone in the panel, I'd be grateful if you'd raise your hand and identify yourself, and maybe I think we have some microphones we might be able to get to you. I see one hand in the front.
My name is Zhumabayev Saparbai. I'm the senior professor of Kazakh University of Technology and Business from Astana. So let me introduce myself once again. Can you hear interpretation?
For you yet, we will be in a second.
About the dollars, about dollar, United States. Countries, Eurasian Economic Unit, Russia, Belarus, Armenia, Kyrgyz, Kazakhstan, date the trading in local currency. I know, as you know, countries of BRICS decide to trading in local countries. What what about future of dollars? My question, please.
I think that's a terrific question. Who would like to take the future of the dollar as the international trade currency? Don't all rush. Ivalo.
So, you know, it's one thing to express a desire to trade in currency X, it's another to make that happen. You know, reserve currencies have specific features that enable them to be used by countries, right? The country issuing that currency has to be able to, perhaps over a long period of time, sustain current account deficits so they can supply that currency to the rest of the world. Would the BRICS countries that trade in local currencies, would they have a counterpart that is willing to trade, to accumulate these large current account deficits over time? Would the country issuing a reserve currency, the country that issues a reserve currency has certain institutions that put it right high on the pedestal of being used as a reserve currency, has a decent court system, judiciary, has a very developed financial system. So there are all these prerequisites that make it very difficult for reserve currencies to appear all of a sudden. You know, it's like Hemingway put in one of his novels, he put it when he talked about bankruptcy, right? That bankruptcy happens slowly, slowly, and then all of a sudden. I think it's the same thing with reserve currencies. They have to start emerging slowly, slowly, and it's difficult to see any reserve currency emerging this way. So I have to say the future of the dollar as a reserve currency is bright. I mean, moreover, you know, a lot of the commodities that are traded on global markets have prices set in dollars. They are set by markets, and so therefore, if you have, you know, let's say Kazakhstan exports petroleum, the price is set in dollars. So even if you settle that in a local currency, it's a far step from, you know, having that local currency being a global reserve currency. There was some piece of news last week that Russia was trading with one country. I'm not going to mention the name, you know, from the news, trading with one country, and Russia had accumulated huge balances of that country's currency, which it cannot now utilize. So these things with the BRICS, you know, using their own currencies to settle trade, another currency supplanting the dollar, you know, they've been appearing over the last 20, 30 years. We are yet to see a credible, different reserve currency from the yen, from the euro, from the British pound. So let me stop here.
Ivalo, just a postscript to that. Last week, the United States came within, 48 hours of defaulting. That didn't seem to shake the confidence in the dollar the way I think a lot of people anticipated. Would you agree?
Fully agree with you. I mean, obviously, it does not necessarily inspire more confidence, right? That a country such as the US could come to the brink, and obviously brings back questions of what can be done to the fiscal system in the US to avoid such clinical, you know, issues in the future. But you're absolutely right, and I agree with you.
Do we have any other questions in the audience? In the front row, yes.
Thank you. Charles, I'd like to ask the panel for their advice or checklist for countries like Kazakhstan that are trying to migrate their economies away from a dependency on commodities towards more value-added industries and services. What's the formula? What's the advice that they'd give those kind of countries?
Oh, another good question. Christian.
And I have a list of 5 conditions that could apply to Kazakh economy to reach the goals you are indicating. First is to keep their good relation with the two big countries, East and West, but to try to develop better relations with the neighbors, what we call the neighbors of the neighbor. This is a classical game in diplomacy, to have the best possible relation with the neighbor of your neighbor. Second, a problem of delocking the economy. We have here a representative of Switzerland. They have the same problem, and they had the same problem in the Austrian Empire, how to delock the economy and to have access to the sea. That's a big problem that has to be addressed too. Third, to give the priority to economic sectors based on comparative advantages of Kazakhstan, like energy, mining, agriculture, higher education, research, and manpower. We know that as a French, you know that our electricity comes from Kazakhstan. Every time we switch on a bulb, we are buying uranium to Kazakhstan. So this is a dependence sort of a dependence we accept because it's Kazakhstan, but it could have been problem with that. But priority to economic sectors based on comparative, to attract foreign investment first, and priority from the neighbors of your neighbors. And the last point is to promote the existing economy of the country and the existing industries. Not only create new industries, but to promote the existing industries and give advantage to extension and improvement of existing facilities, production, and services of high-value product. Thank you.
Andres.
Yeah, I think many of the issues have been covered, but it's good to put them together again. There's a need to do horizontal type of activities and interventions where I think Ivailo has mentioned. In virtually every country, emerging country, you need to improve skills. That implies investing in formal education, from primary education all the way down up to university education, but also on-the-job training. You need to try to introduce and assimilate innovation. Some of it comes from a better skilled workforce, but also you need entrepreneurs, you need people with ideas, and you need the capacity to make sure that they work. You need, I think it was also mentioned by Ivailo, a lot of investment in physical infrastructure. And finally, which is very often overlooked, but is absolutely fundamental, you need to invest in improving your institutional quality. Both formal institutions, from the rule of law, to informal institutions like tackling corruption, that are very often detrimental for any sort of economic activity. But on top, I'll highlight that you need some sort of more targeted policy. And here I'll start with Christian's last point. Beware of high-tech fantasies. Beware of trying to build something on the basis of what you don't have. Because it might work, but in 99% of cases, it's never going to work. You need to start building from your industries, existing activities, not to just keep doing the same, but to improve and increase the complexity and move and diversify into related sectors. If you do that, you are building on what you have to create something new. And if you have the basis of better skills, better innovation, better institutions, and more infrastructure, you're going to make sure that that economy is going to be far more resilient, but also is going to fire on all cylinders, mobilize in its full potential.
Ivailo, you have your hand up.
So you know, countries export goods and services that are intensive in the factors of production they have. So you look at the structure of wealth of Kazakhstan, a huge chunk, 70%, is commodities. So obviously, natural resources. So obviously the country is going to integrate with the rest of the world on the basis of commodities. East Asia in the 90s, when you looked at the structure of wealth in East Asia in the early 1990s, the most abundant factor of production was inexpensive, cheap labor. This is what they exported commodities, they exported goods and services, intensive in cheap labor. European Union has, physical capital as the main factor of production. They export manufactured goods and so on and so on. And so therefore, there's nothing wrong with a country such as Kazakhstan or the other resource-rich countries of Eurasia to be exporting commodities. Now you're asking, how do they go to other areas? I mean, obviously you cannot export something that you cannot produce. To produce a sophisticated car, you need skilled labor. So therefore, in my view, the most important things you can do to diversify exports is actually to diversify your assets, the assets, the parts of your national wealth. Human capital. Kazakhstan has very substantial amounts of money in its oil fund. Our suggestions to the government have been, go crazy on education. Spend as much money as you need to raise the quality of education. You look at the quality of education, it's not where it should be for a country that is, a few years away from high income status. Go crazy on the quality of education. As Andres said, improve rapidly the quality of institutions. Most important, competition. Make it possible so that there is a level playing field between private and public companies. It's very difficult for private companies to enter into fields that are dominated by public companies or by connected companies. And then last but not least, fiscal policy. Fiscal policy for resource-rich countries is typically pro-cyclical. Kazakhstan 10 years ago it was not. Lately it has become pro-cyclical. Make fiscal policy at least as-cyclical, meaning not move with the cycle of the economy, so it doesn't amplify the commodity cycles and let the economy develop on its own. So I think these three things, improve institutions, notably competition, go really full speed on education, and remove the pro-cyclicality of fiscal policy. I think this would go a long way towards improving the quality, the composition of your national wealth. That would ultimately result in a more diversified exports. By that time, however, you're not going to care because you're going to have such high level of income that you may be like Australia that has a very concentrated exports, right? But it has very high level of GDP per capita, and they don't care that it's concentrated in commodities and in education services. Thank you.
Before we began the session, we talked among ourselves, and we were determined that we weren't going to just enumerate the problems, that we wanted to find some suggestions for moving forward and actually finding a way, charting a path out of growth. So I'm very happy with the way we're ending up here today with some very positive suggestions, which I think might be helpful not just for Kazakhstan, but for the global economy as a whole. I'm going to turn to Mirek for a final word on this, and then I'm afraid we're running out of time, so we're going to have to wrap it up. Mirek, it's over to you.
No, thank you. Just to add to the great contributions of my colleagues, just if I were to choose one thing, I would double down on making sure that I invest heavily in lowering the barriers to entry to entrepreneurship. I think around competition, entrepreneurship, because sometimes I feel bad when economies, we say, okay, well, don't bet on high tech. And I agree with that. I think it's very hard to really bet if you are doing it centrally, vertically. The best solution really is, in my view, is to invest everything you can through the different measures that we've just listed to lower the barrier to entry for stakeholders here to enrich the competitive landscape.
Lowering the barriers to entrepreneurship, putting a lot more money into education, and stimulating competition. All of those things would certainly be advisable for Kazakhstan and for a lot of other countries in the global economy. Thank you all so much for your attention this afternoon. We ran just a little bit long, and I hope that doesn't complicate your schedules. I want to thank everybody on the panel. You were terrific, and you gave a lot of insight to a kind of a thorny problem. So let's thank the panel. Thank you very much. Well done. Thank you, folks.